The vault was older than the fortress itself. That was the first thing anyone who entered it noticed, the way the stone breathed differently down there, the way the air carried a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. The walls were not simply old, they were ancient in the way that certain silences are ancient, the kind that have absorbed so many sounds over so many centuries that they've become something else entirely. Something patient, something aware. Kael had built the fortress above it, not the other way around. He had found the vault first, half buried in the rock of the Ashspine Mountains, and he had recognized it immediately for what it was: not a dungeon, not a tomb, not a treasury, though it had served as all three at various points in its long and largely forgotten history. It was a container, and a container, by its very nature, implied that something somewhere was meant to go inside it. Kael had spent 4 centuries waiting to find out what that something was. He was not, by the standards of his kind, an unusually old demon lord. There were older ones, creatures who had watched the first human kingdoms rise from nothing more than cookfires and ambition, who remembered when the great forests covered half the known world and the mountains had different names. By comparison, Kael was almost young enough to still feel the particular irritation of not knowing things. Young enough for curiosity to function in him less like a luxury and more like a persistent ache. He stood at the entrance to the vault now, as he often did in the hour before dawn when the fortress above him had finally gone quiet, and he looked down the long corridor that led to the chamber at its center. The corridor was lit by a row of blue flame torches that he had installed himself 300 years ago and had never needed to replace. The light they cast was steady and cold and honest in the way that firelight rarely manages to be. It showed everything clearly. It hid nothing. At the end of the corridor, behind a door made of a black metal that had no name in any language currently spoken, was a cell. And in that cell for the past 6 days sat the prisoner. Kael turned away from the entrance and walked back through the upper corridor toward the winding stone stairs that connected the vault level to the rest of the fortress. He was not going down there tonight. He had already decided that. He went through the decision again as he climbed the stairs, examining it from different angles the way you check a door to make sure it's locked, and he found it unchanged. Not tonight. The prisoner needed more time. More time for what exactly was a question he was less certain about. His name, the full version of it, the one with weight and history attached, was Kael of the Ashspine, though most who knew of him used the shortened form out of simple practicality. His titles were numerous and largely self-assigned, as such things tended to be in the hierarchy of demon lords, where the gap between reputation and reality was kept deliberately wide. Lord of the Ashspine, Keeper of the Pale Flame, the Undeceived, that last one was his favorite and also the most accurate. He had worked hard for it. He had a face that looked like it had been designed for intimidation and then revised somewhere along the way toward something more complicated. Strong features, dark eyes that caught light in a way that suggested they were doing something more than just receiving it. He was tall in the way that certain old things are tall, not simply in terms of height, but in terms of presence, the sense that he occupied more space than his physical dimensions strictly accounted for. His horns were modest by demon lord standards, curving back from his temples in a way that was almost architectural. He had never bothered to have them filed or decorated, which said something about him that he was aware of and did not particularly mind saying. He reached the top of the stairs and moved through the upper corridors of the fortress with the quiet, habitual ease of someone navigating a space they have lived in long enough to stop thinking about. The fortress was large, not extravagantly so, but large enough to house the several hundred demons, lesser spirits, and assorted beings who made up his court and kept his various enterprises running. At this hour, the corridors were largely empty, a guard at the eastern passage. A scribe who worked through the night by personal preference. A creature that had attached itself to the fortress's outer walls sometime in the last century and which Kael had never bothered to evict, partly because it was harmless and partly because he had developed a vague fondness for the sounds it made during storms. He entered his study and went directly to the window that faced west, toward the valley below and the faint smudge of human settlement visible on clear days about 30 miles out. He stood there for a while without lighting the lamps. The sky outside was the particular dark blue that precedes dawn, not the absolute black of true night, but something transitional, something between states. He had always liked this hour. He was thinking about the prisoner. It had started, as a number of significant things in Kael's long life had started, with a piece of information he wasn't supposed to have. The intelligence had come through one of his networks, a carefully maintained web of informants and listeners that stretched from the southern trading cities to the northern monasteries and covered a great deal of ground in between. He had been building this network for over a century, not for any specific purpose, but because information was the one currency that consistently held its value across all the political upheavals and economic collapses he had witnessed. Empires came and went. Gold was melted down and recast. Information, properly stored and properly understood, stayed true. What came through the network in this case was a rumor, a very specific kind of rumor, the kind that is told in a lowered voice, that travels through 3 or 4 intermediaries before it reaches anyone who might know what to do with it, and that carries in its very discretion the suggestion that whoever is keeping it secret has good reason to do so. The rumor was about a person. Not a demon, not a spirit, not a creature of the kind that appears in the older records as a category rather than an individual. A person, a human woman specifically who had been living for the past decade under the protection of the Order of the Pale Meridian, one of the quieter and more intellectually serious of the human scholarly orders, the kind that rarely made enemies because they rarely made news. The order occupied a modest complex in the foothills about 200 miles south of the Ashspine, and they kept to themselves with the focused determination of people who have too much work to get involved in other people's problems. The rumor said that this woman was not, strictly speaking, a scholar, she was something else. The rumor used several different words for what she was, none of them quite landing correctly, the way that multiple imprecise descriptions sometimes circle around a truth that language hasn't yet found the right shape for. What the rumor agreed on across all its various versions and retellings was this: she knew something specific, something that a number of very powerful parties had spent a very long time trying to find and that she had somehow managed to hold onto despite those efforts. The rumor did not specify what she knew. That was, Kael had noted at the time, perhaps the most interesting part of the whole thing. He had sent 2 of his people south to learn more. They came back with a name, Seren, and a physical description, and a report that was longer and more careful than he had expected. His people were thorough, but this report had the quality of thoroughness that comes not from professionalism alone but from genuine interest, the sense that the people writing it had found themselves unexpectedly engaged by their subject. That, too, Kael had noted. He had spent 2 months reading everything his network could gather about her. He had spent another month deciding what to do, and then he had done it, a clean operation, a single night, no casualties. The woman moved from the Order's protection to the vault beneath his fortress with a minimum of drama and a maximum of care. The care was important. He wanted that understood from the beginning, even if the understanding was only between himself and his own conscience. This was not a kidnapping in the ordinary sense, or rather it was technically, but it was a kidnapping conducted with the specific intention of not causing harm to the person being taken, which he recognized was a fine distinction and not one that the person in question would necessarily find reassuring. He had included several comfort items in the cell, a good chair, proper bedding, Books, because the reports suggested she read constantly and he had not wanted her to be without that. Lamps that gave warm rather than cold light, because cold light in an enclosed space was one of those small cruelties that accumulated. He was not trying to be cruel. That was the thing he found himself returning to again and again in the days since her arrival. He was trying to be something more complicated than cruel, and he was not entirely sure whether the distinction mattered or whether he was simply telling himself a story about his own motivations that was more flattering than accurate. On the morning of the 7th day, he finally went down. He descended the stairs alone, which was his practice. He had made it clear from the beginning that no one else was to enter the vault level while the prisoner was there, a directive that his court had accepted without question because they had learned over the years that when Kael chose silence about something, the silence was intentional rather than forgetful. If he wanted them to know, he would tell them. If he didn't tell them, they waited. The corridor stretched ahead of him, blue flame torches steady in the unchanging air. His footsteps were quiet on the old stone, not careful quiet, the way someone moves when they're trying not to be heard, but the natural quiet of someone who has spent a long time around silence and has absorbed some of its habits. He walked at an even pace and let himself think about nothing in particular, which was a discipline he had cultivated over centuries and found useful for clearing away the accumulated noise of reasoning before entering a situation that might require clear perception. He stopped outside the black door. He could feel through some quality of the vault that he had never fully been able to articulate that she was awake. The vault did that, communicated states of being the way a good room communicates whether it's occupied or empty, a quality of presence or absence that registered below conscious thought. She was awake, and she had been awake for some time, and she was not, at this particular moment, afraid. That was interesting. He had expected her to be afraid. Fear at this stage would have been entirely rational. He had been prepared for it, had thought through how to respond to it, how to move carefully around it, how to give it the space it would need. But the quality coming through the vault's old stone was not fear. It was something more settled than that. Something that in a human he might have called composure, except that composure usually contains, underneath it, the effort of maintaining itself, and this felt less like effort and more like a natural state. He unlatched the door and opened it and stepped inside. She was sitting in the chair he had provided, which she had moved to face the door. The book in her lap was closed, a finger keeping her place. She looked up at him with the expression of someone who has been expecting a visitor and is willing to find out what the visit is about before deciding how to feel about it. She was perhaps 35, though with humans that estimate could be off by a decade in either direction. Dark hair cut practically short, eyes that were a light shade of something grey or green or both depending on the light. She was not, by the standards that his world and her world would each separately apply, conventionally striking, but there was something in the way she held herself, in the way her gaze moved to him and stayed there without flinching, that made the room feel different with her in it. "You're him," she said. Her voice was steady. "The Demon Lord." "Kael," he said, "you can use the name." She looked at him for a moment longer. "All right," she said. "Kael." She said it the way you repeat a word you're not sure you'll be using often enough to bother learning, but you're going to learn it anyway because it's there. "I've been waiting for you to come down." "I know," he said. "I wanted to give you time to settle." She glanced around the cell, the good chair, the bedding, the lamp giving its warm light, the stack of books he had chosen based on the reports about her reading habits. "You were thorough," she said. There was nothing particular in her voice when she said it, not gratitude, not resentment, just the acknowledgement of a fact. "I tried to be," he said. He pulled a second chair from where he had placed it against the wall. He had put it there 3 days ago against the possibility of this conversation, and set it several feet from her and sat down. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to suggest distance was what he wanted. He had thought about the geometry of this moment with more care than he was entirely comfortable admitting to himself. She watched him do this, then she looked at him directly. "So," she said, "what is it you think I know?" And Kael, who had not felt genuinely uncertain about the beginning of a conversation in longer than he could clearly remember, found that he was not quite ready to answer. The silence that followed her question was not an uncomfortable one. That surprised him slightly. Silences in interrogation-adjacent situations, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that this was an interrogation-adjacent situation, regardless of how carefully he'd arranged the furniture, tended to carry weight, to press against both parties until one of them spoke just to release the pressure. This silence didn't do that. It simply sat between them, patient and unhurried, while he looked at her and she looked back at him, and they both took the measure of what they were dealing with. "You're more composed than I expected," he said, which was not the answer to her question but was true, and he had found over the centuries that starting with something true was generally more productive than starting with something strategic. "Is that a problem?" she asked. "No," he said, "it's an observation." She shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting the book in her lap without opening it. "I've had a week to adjust," she said, "and before that I'd been living under the Order's protection for 10 years. That kind of life teaches you to stay calm about things you can't control. If I'd fallen apart every time a situation felt dangerous, I'd have been very tired for a very long time." "The Order's protection," he said, "you were aware it wasn't adequate." "I was aware it was the best available option," she said, which was a careful distinction, and he recognized it as such. "Not the same thing. I knew someone would eventually find me. I'd been realistic about that for years." A brief pause. "I didn't expect it to be a demon lord. I'd been thinking more along the lines of the conclave." The conclave, he filed that away. It was a confirmation of something he'd suspected but hadn't been certain of, that whoever had been looking for her had significant institutional backing, not simply individual interest. "Tell me why the conclave would be looking for you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me first what you already know. I'd rather not repeat myself, and I'd rather know what I'm actually filling in before I start talking." He considered this. It was a reasonable position, the position of someone who understood that information, once given, could not be retrieved, and who wanted to ensure that any exchange was an actual exchange rather than a donation. He found he respected it. "I know your name," he said. "Seren, I know that you lived inside a scholarly community for a decade and that you were not technically a scholar. I know that several parties have been looking for you with varying degrees of urgency for reasons that are connected to something you carry, not physically, presumably, but in terms of knowledge. I know that the people most urgently searching for you are not the kind who would have treated you carefully if they'd reached you first. And I know that whatever you know is old, older than the current political order, older, possibly, than most of the institutions that are currently interested in it." She listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her thumb moving along the spine of the book in her lap in a small, unconscious gesture. "That's more than I thought you'd have," she said. "I've had 4 months to gather it." 4 months she absorbed this. "You planned this carefully." "I plan most things carefully," he said. "I find it saves time later." Something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. And yet here you are, 6 days later than you could have been, sitting across from me and still not entirely sure how to start this conversation. He looked at her. No, he said, I know how to start it. I'm deciding how honest to be about why I'm starting it. That landed differently than his previous statements. She was quiet for a slightly longer beat, reading him the way she might read a passage that had more complexity in it than the surrounding text had prepared her for. That's an interesting thing to say, she said finally. It's the truth. Yes, that's what makes it interesting. He told her then, not everything. He was not so transformed by the strangeness of the situation that he had abandoned all judgment, but the essential things, the vault and how he had found it and how he had spent 4 centuries understanding what it was, the information that had come through his network about her, the 2 months of research, the single night of action, the care he had taken in arranging this cell. He told her about the decision not to come down immediately and why. He told her that he was not interested in delivering her to anyone, that he had no intention of using her as a bargaining piece in whatever larger game was currently in motion around her existence, and that whatever he wanted from her, it was going to have to be something she gave voluntarily, because he had seen enough of the world to know that information extracted under duress was unreliable information, and unreliable information was something he had less than no use for. She listened to all of this the same way she'd listened to his initial summary, without interrupting, without the kind of visible reaction that gives away which parts land hardest. She was, he thought, someone who had learned to process information before displaying a response to it. That, too, was a kind of discipline. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me, she said, that you went to significant effort and personal risk to bring me here. You don't intend to coerce me, and you're waiting for me to volunteer what I know based on what? Trust, goodwill. Based on me giving you a reason, he said. What reasons? He leaned forward slightly, not aggressively. He was careful about his posture in this room, aware of the physical difference between them and what it might communicate. But there was something he needed her to see in what he said next, and distance was the enemy of clarity. The vault, he said, the one that's been surrounding you for the past week. You've been sitting in it, sleeping in it, existing in it. What have you noticed? She didn't answer immediately. She looked away from him toward the wall, the old stone, the texture of something that had been here far longer than either of them. And then she looked back, and her expression had changed in a way that was subtle but significant. It's listening, she said quietly, not like someone making a claim, but like someone confirming something they'd been trying to convince themselves wasn't true. I noticed it on the second night, the way the air moves, the way the stone. She stopped. I didn't want to say it because it sounds irrational. It's not irrational, he said. It's accurate. The vault is listening. It has been for a very long time. What I don't know, what I have not been able to determine in 4 centuries, is what it's been listening for. She was looking at him differently now, not with less caution. The caution was still there, sensible and appropriate, but with the addition of something else. The particular expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just encountered someone who might actually understand the weight of it. I know what it's listening for, she said. I know you do, he said. That's why you're here. She didn't tell him that day. He didn't push. That was important, not performing patience but actually exercising it, letting the conversation end where it ended and standing up and telling her he would come back tomorrow and that if she needed anything in the meantime she should knock twice on the door and someone would answer. He had arranged this specifically. He did not want her to feel sealed in, even if the door was locked from the outside. The difference between a prison and an enforced residence was partly physical and partly a matter of how you treated the person inside, and he was more conscious of that difference than he could entirely account for. On his way back up the corridor, he stopped and stood for a moment in the blue flame light and let himself think about what had just happened. She had said she knew, she had not said she would tell him. Those were two different things, and he had learned long ago not to conflate them. But she had also said without prompting that the vault was listening, and the way she'd said it quietly with the particular reluctance of someone naming something they've known and not spoken suggested that this was information she had been holding carefully, information that had significance beyond simple fact, information connected to whatever larger knowledge she'd been living with for a decade. He was patient. He was genuinely patient, not the performed patience of a creature waiting to pounce, but the real thing, the kind that had developed over 4 centuries of paying attention and learning that most things revealed themselves eventually to someone willing to wait properly. But there was underneath the patience something he recognized as anticipation, sharpened and specific, the feeling of a long question finally within range of an answer. He climbed the stairs. The fortress above was waking up the sounds of the early morning shift, the distant clang from the kitchens, a conversation in a far corridor muffled to something wordless by the stone between. He moved through it all with his usual quiet ease, and he thought about Seren and the vault and the 400 years of waiting, and he found that for the first time in a long time, the waiting felt like it was pointing somewhere specific. She told him on the 3rd day of his visiting. Not in one clean disclosure, it came the way significant things often come in layers, each conversation pulling back something that the one before had begun to loosen. He came down every morning in the hour before the fortress's main activity began and sat in the second chair, and they talked, not always about the thing that mattered most, about other things first, about the order and what her years there had been like, about the conclave and what she understood of their interest. About the nature of old knowledge and why it was dangerous, and who decided when it became too dangerous to carry alone. She was, he discovered, precise in her thinking in a way that had nothing to do with academic training. She had been formally educated to a point, and then educated herself beyond it through necessity rather than preference, the education of someone who'd needed to understand her situation in order to survive it. She thought carefully and spoke carefully, and she listened with the same quality of attention she'd displayed in their first conversation, the sense that her hearing was not passive but active, genuinely engaged with what came in. He told her things too. He had not anticipated this. He had imagined the early conversations as a kind of infrastructure building, the necessary groundwork of trust, but groundwork that would flow primarily in one direction, things he offered, positions he established, the gradual architecture of her confidence in him. What he had not imagined was that he would find himself genuinely engaged in the conversation, offering things not strategically, but because she asked questions that he had not been asked in a very long time, and the questions deserved real answers. She asked him on the 2nd day why he had not simply used the vault as a treasury, why he had left it essentially empty for 4 centuries when it was clearly impregnable and could have housed his most valuable possessions. He could have given her the answer he gave his court when they asked, which was about the vault's particular properties making it unsuitable for conventional storage. Instead, he told her the truth, that he had known from the beginning that the vault was waiting for something, and that putting ordinary treasures inside it had always felt like an insult to whatever that something was. Like setting a dinner table beautifully and then putting takeaway food on the plates. She'd looked at him when he said this, and then away, and there was something moving across her face that he couldn't read precisely, some complicated intersection of emotions that she was processing privately. "The vault has been waiting for me," she said. "It was not a question." "I think," he said carefully, "that the vault has been waiting for what you know. Whether that's the same thing depends on how inseparable you are from it." She was quiet for a moment, then "pretty inseparable," she said, "at this point." What she knew, what she told him the following morning, with the careful deliberateness of someone handing over something irreplaceable and watching very closely how the recipient receives it, was about the nature of the vault itself. Not just this vault, vaults, a category of them built across the known world in an era so far preceding the current one that the civilization that had built them was not even properly remembered, had been reduced to a set of fragmented references in the oldest texts, and a handful of physical structures that people had built on top of, built around, or simply avoided for reasons they couldn't articulate. This civilization, she called it the First Order, not the order she had lived in, but a much older thing, the origin of several things that had persisted in diminished and distorted form into the present, had built the vaults as containers, not for objects, for concepts. The idea was this: there are things that cannot be destroyed but that must not circulate freely. Not dangerous ideas in the crude sense, not instructions or weapons or political information. Older things, things that operated at the level of the real's fundamental structure, things that once widely known would alter the relationship between the living and the non-living, between intention and consequence, between the kind of being that reasons and the world that it reasons about. The First Order had understood these things, had contained them in a form that was more than writing, a form that was something like a living pattern, something that persisted in the stone itself, requiring only the right kind of attention to be accessed. The vaults were not simply storage, they were comprehension, and the thing that they required, the thing that unlocked them, was not a key or a spell or a physical mechanism. It was a specific quality of knowing. The right person with the right understanding of what the vault contained could receive what was held inside it. And Seren, through a chain of events she described with the practicality of someone who had made peace with the strangeness of their own history, had been living with exactly that quality of knowing for most of her adult life. She knew how to unlock this vault, she knew what was inside it, and she had not told anyone for 10 years because the people who had been searching for her had not been searching for her in order to receive what she knew. They had been searching for her in order to take it, to extract it through methods that would leave her without it and deliver it to institutions that had no business possessing anything of the kind. She told him all of this in a clear, level voice, and when she was done, the room was very quiet. "You're telling me this now," he said, because you asked me why you'd left the vault empty," she said, "and you told me the truth, and the truth you told me is the right answer." She looked at him directly. "You've been keeping it for the right thing, you just didn't know what the right thing was." And now, she said, "you know." She paused, then more quietly, "The question is what you're going to do about it." What Kael did immediately was nothing. Not from indecision, he was not someone who suffered from indecision, had not been for a very long time, but from the recognition that the situation called for a particular kind of stillness. He had been given, in the span of a single conversation, the answer to a question that had occupied him for 400 years. He had been told by a woman sitting in a chair in the oldest room he had ever encountered that the vault beneath his fortress was not an empty container but a full one, and that the person who could access what it held was right in front of him. The rational response to this sequence of events was not immediate action. The rational response was to sit with it. He thanked her, which surprised her. He could see that it did, the small adjustment in her posture, the slight widening of attention in her eyes. He told her he needed time to think, which was true. He stood up, he folded the second chair back against the wall, and he left the vault and climbed the stairs and walked through the gradually waking fortress to his study and stood at the window for the better part of 2 hours. The first thing he was thinking about was what she had said, not the information itself, the first order, the vaults, the structure of what was contained, but the end of it, the question she had asked, "What are you going to do about it?" It was a genuinely open question, and she had asked it as one without assuming the answer. He found that significant. She had been living with this knowledge for a decade, had been protecting it through considerable personal sacrifice, and she had handed it to him not because she had run out of options, but because she had decided, on the basis of a few days of conversation and one honest answer about a dinner table, that he was the right recipient. That was either very good judgment or a very significant act of trust, and he was not yet sure which, and he was not sure it mattered which because the result was the same. The second thing he was thinking about was whether she was right about him. This was the more uncomfortable thread, and he followed it with the same honesty he tried to bring to most things about himself, which was to say with some resistance and ultimately without flinching. She had said that he had been keeping the vault for the right thing without knowing what the right thing was. She had framed this as evidence that he was the right person to receive this knowledge, but evidence could be read more than one way. He had kept the vault empty because it had felt wrong to fill it with ordinary things, but feeling was not the same as moral clarity, and he was honest enough to know that his instincts, while generally reliable, were not infallible. He was a demon lord. He had done things over 4 centuries that a careful audit of his character would not entirely support. He had made decisions that were expedient rather than good. He had chosen his own interests over others' well-being in situations where the calculation had been close. He was not a villain in any straightforward sense, but he was not a hero either, and the question of whether the keeper of something ancient and powerful needed to be a hero was one he was not in a position to answer objectively. What he came back to, when he finished following these threads, was a simpler question. What did he actually want to do with whatever was in the vault? He thought about this carefully. He let himself be honest about it in the way that you can only be honest when you're alone with your own reasoning and no one else can observe the process. He thought about what it would mean to access the vault's knowledge, what the effect would be, whether the effect was something he wanted to be responsible for, and in what way, and toward what end. By the time the fortress was fully active around him and his presence was being requested in the upper hall for the morning briefing, he had arrived at something that was not quite a decision, but was the shape of one, the outline of what he was going to do, missing only the details of how. That afternoon he sent a message through his network, not to anyone he typically corresponded with. The message went southward more carefully than most of his communications traveled through 4 separate hands before it reached its destination. He did not expect a response quickly. He arranged for things to continue normally in the meantime, attended to the regular business of the fortress, and went down to visit Seren in the evening rather than the morning, which was a change from the pattern he'd established and which he suspected she would notice. She had noticed. She was at the cell door when he arrived, which meant she'd heard him on the stairs, which meant she was paying close attention to the sounds of this place. He found that he appreciated it, the alertness of someone who understood their situation and was taking it seriously. "Evening visit," she said, "not an accusation, just a notation." "I had things to do this morning," he said. The briefing, she said, and then at his expression, the fortress has a rhythm, I can hear some of it, not voices but activity, patterns, a small pause, I've been mapping it. How far have you gotten? Far enough to know that the morning briefing is real and important and that you attend it regularly, far enough to know that the night watch rotation changes at the second hour. She looked at him steadily. I'm not planning to escape, I'm just doing what I do with any environment, trying to understand it. I know, he said, I'd have been disappointed if you weren't. He sat down, he told her without preamble what he had spent the morning thinking. He told her his concerns about himself, the question of whether he was the right person for this, the audit of his own history, the gap between instinct and clarity. He told her about the message he'd sent and who he'd sent it to and why. And then he waited. The person he had sent the message to was someone Seren knew. The response in her face when he explained this was complex recognition, something that might have been relief, and underneath both of those something more careful, more measured. The person was an archivist who had been connected at the edges to the scholarly network that the Order of the Pale Meridian moved through. A human woman, not young, who had spent 50 years building an understanding of the First Order's legacy that was more complete than anyone else currently living. Kael had known of her for decades. He had not, until now, had reason to contact her directly. You sent for Marat, Seren said. Her voice was very steady. Yes. She stopped. Then, that's a good decision. You sound surprised. I sound relieved, she said, and the steadiness in her voice shifted slightly, carrying for the first time in their conversations the texture of something that had been held tightly and was loosening. I sound relieved because Marat is the one person I've wanted to reach for 6 years and haven't been able to, and because the fact that you thought to contact her means you're thinking about this correctly. What do you mean, haven't been able to? She looked at him, because the conclave has people watching her. I couldn't contact her from inside the order without drawing them directly to her door. I couldn't contact her from outside the order because outside the order I had no safe channels. She paused. But a demon lord's network is something else entirely. They won't be watching for communication moving through your channels. No, he said, they won't. She was quiet for a moment and he let her be quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had returned to its usual steadiness, but there was a quality underneath it that he was beginning to recognize, the quality of someone readjusting to a situation that has unexpectedly changed for the better. How long for a response? 2 weeks, possibly 3. She may need to travel carefully. I can wait, she said. I've been waiting for 6 years. The 2 weeks that followed established a rhythm that neither of them commented on explicitly, but that both of them understood and in which both found something that Kael at least had not expected to find. He came down every morning and sometimes in the evening. They talked not always about the vault or the First Order or the conclave, about other things, about the history of the Ashspine region, which she had read about extensively and had a number of specific questions regarding. About the nature of demon lords as an institution versus demon lords as individuals, a distinction she made with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way not to let category do the work that specificity required. About books. About the particular comfort and particular isolation of living under someone else's protection for a long time. He had the second chair moved inside the cell permanently. This seemed like the right thing to do, the right acknowledgement of what the visits actually were, which was less interrogation and more something else, something he chose not to name too precisely, because naming had a way of making things formal that were better left as natural. She asked him about 10 days in about the things he regretted. It was not an interrogative question, not searching for weakness or leverage. It came out of a conversation about the accumulation of long lives, how time didn't simply add to itself but layered, and how the layers changed what was on top. He told her about a war he had helped to start 300 years ago that had not ended the way anyone involved had intended. He told her about a creature he had failed to protect through a combination of overconfidence and a decision made too quickly. He told her about a decade early in his career as a lord, when his ambition had outrun his ethics by a significant margin, and he had done things he still thought about in the particular way you think about things you cannot undo. She listened to all of this. She didn't absolve him, he hadn't asked her to and would not have wanted it if she had, but she received what he said with a quality of attention that he had not experienced often. The quality of someone who understands that history is real, that the people who carry it are real, and that the most honest thing you can do with someone else's difficult truth is simply to hear it. What changed, she asked, not asking for a redemption narrative, asking with genuine curiosity, the kind that wants the real answer. I got older, he said, and I got more interested in things that outlasted me, he thought for a moment, and I got more honest about the difference between what I actually valued and what I decided I valued because it was useful to value it. She nodded, not in agreement exactly, but in the way you nod when something lands true enough to deserve acknowledgement. The vault, she said, you left it empty. For 4 centuries you left the most secure space you had empty because filling it felt wrong. That's not ambition, that's not strategy. She looked at him. That's patience in service of something you couldn't even name yet. Is that good? He asked, not rhetorically. He genuinely wanted to know what she thought. I think, she said slowly, it's the kind of thing that tells you more about someone than most of the things they choose deliberately. Marit arrived 17 days after the message was sent. She was exactly what Kael's intelligence had suggested and also more than it. A small woman who moved with the slightly deliberate care of someone whose joints had opinions about stairs, who had white hair cut practically and eyes that reminded Kael of someone doing constant arithmetic. She arrived at the fortress gate in the company of 2 of his people who had escorted her north, and when she stood in his entrance hall and looked around, her expression was the expression of someone making notes. Demon Lord Kael, she said when he came to meet her. Her voice was dry and had the particular cadence of someone who had been giving lectures for 50 years and had developed an unconscious tendency to speak in structured paragraphs. I've read about you, more carefully, I suspect, than most. And, he said, and I have some questions, which I imagine can wait until after I've seen her. He liked her immediately. He led her down himself, which she did not comment on but which he thought she registered. When he opened the door and Marit stepped inside and Seren saw her, something happened in the room that he felt rather than witnessed, the quality of the air, the way the vault responded, some shift in the feeling of the space that he would not have known to name 6 months ago, but that he now recognized as the vault responding to something being in the right place. Seren stood up, the book she'd been holding dropped to the chair behind her, unnoticed. She crossed the room in 3 steps and Marit met her halfway and they held onto each other for a moment in the simple, wordless way of people who have been worried about each other for a very long time. Kael stepped back toward the doorway and gave them the rooms. He stood in the corridor for a while, listening to the old stone, and the old stone listened back, and the blue flame torches burned their steady cold light in the air around him, and he thought about patience and what it was for. The 3 of them sat together that evening, Kael and Marit and Seren, the second chair joined by a third that Kael brought down from the corridor, and the conversation that followed was one of the most significant he had been part of in a life that had contained a number of significant conversations. Marit had, as she'd indicated, questions. She asked them in her structured, unhurried way, and Seren answered some and Kael answered others, and there were moments where all three of them were quiet together, thinking through the same thing from different angles. What they arrived at by the end of the evening was an understanding. Not a plan exactly, the plan would come later, would require more thought and more information and the kind of careful assembly of elements that Kael was practiced at and that Marit, he discovered, was equally practiced at through a different kind of discipline. But the understanding was there. What was in the vault, what accessing it would mean, who needed to be involved, and what had to happen before any of it could move forward. "The conclave will know you're here," Kael said to Marit at the end, not as a threat or a warning, simply as a fact they needed to account for. "Eventually," Marit agreed, "not immediately. Your channels were well chosen." "How long do you estimate we have?" She thought about this with the arithmetic expression. "A month perhaps, possibly 6 weeks if we are careful." "That's enough time," Seren said. She was not asking. She had the tone of someone who had done the calculation and arrived at an answer they trusted. Kael looked at both of them. "Then we used the time correctly," he said. They went back upstairs together, Kael and Marit, leaving Seren to sleep, the vault settling around her the way a room settles around someone it has grown accustomed to. On the stairs, Marit walked beside him without speaking for the first few steps, and then she said quietly, "She trusts you." "Yes," he said. "Are you going to deserve it?" He thought about this seriously, the way the question deserved. "I'm going to try to make sure it doesn't matter whether I deserve it," he said. "I'm going to try to make the outcome good enough that the question of deserving is beside the point." Marit considered this. "That's a better answer than I expected," she said. "I've had time to think," he said. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. They climbed the rest of the stairs in companionable quiet, and the fortress received them, and below them the vault held what it had been holding for longer than anyone could clearly account for. The unlocking took place on a morning that looked like any other morning. No ceremony, no ritual assembly. No preparation beyond what they had quietly arranged over the previous weeks, the removal of certain monitoring wards that the conclave maintained at a distance, a task Kael had completed with the help of 2 of his most skilled people, the establishment of a small archive space in the chamber adjacent to the vault, set up by Marit with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been preparing for this particular intellectual event for most of her professional life. And the conversations between the 3 of them that had taken place each day, layering understanding on understanding the way you lay groundwork before building something that needs to last. They went down together, the 3 of them, in the blue flame light of the corridors. Marit had her satchel. She had explained what was in it with the brief precision of someone who understood that the people she was explaining to were capable of handling the information, recording materials adapted for the kind of content that might emerge from a first-order source, several items she had gathered over 50 years of archival work, and a small device of her own construction that she declined to describe further. Kael had accepted this without pressing. He was, by this point, several weeks into a working relationship with Marit that had established its own effective rhythms, chief among which was that she told you what you needed to know and trusted you to be intelligent enough not to require the rest. Seren walked slightly ahead of them. She had been quiet since they'd begun the walk down, not the careful quiet of someone managing themselves, but a natural quiet, the quiet of someone moving toward something they've been moving toward for a long time and no longer need to think about the direction. At the door to the cell, they paused. Not in here, Seren said. She turned and looked at the wall opposite the cell door, the wall that faced further into the rock, the wall that was the oldest part of the vault, older than the corridor, older than the construction around it. She placed her palm flat against it. Kael watched. He had seen significant things. He had been alive for 400 years and had witnessed events that would fill several books and had developed, as a result, a fairly stable equilibrium with the remarkable. But what happened when Seren's hand touched the wall was something that bypassed equilibrium entirely and reached something older, some quality of response that was not excitement exactly or awe exactly, but something that had the texture of both while being simpler than either. So the wall moved. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical machinery of the kind of door that wants to impress. It moved the way very old, very well-made things move, with a kind of settled certainty, the way a lock opens when the right key turns it and the mechanism has been waiting so long that the opening has a quality almost of relief. The stone shifted inward along a seam that had been invisible and revealed, beyond it, a second chamber that Kael had not known existed. He had stood in this corridor for 400 years. He had put his hands on every surface of this vault. He had never found this door. The vault hides itself, Seren said quietly without turning, from people who are looking for the wrong thing. She looked over her shoulder at him. You were never looking for it, you were waiting. That's different, that's why it let you stay. He thought about this. He thought about 4 centuries of standing in this corridor with blue flame light and a sense of patient anticipation and no clear idea of what he was anticipating. It tolerated me, he said. It chose you, she said. There's a difference. The chamber beyond was not large, smaller actually than the cell, than the room that had been Seren's home for these past weeks. But size was not the point of it and never had been. The walls were covered in something that was not writing, exactly, closer to a form of notation that used shapes rather than letters, a visual language that Marit moved toward immediately with the expression of someone encountering something they have studied from a great distance and are now seeing close up for the first time in their life. At the center of the chamber was a formation of stone that rose from the floor to about the height of a table. It was not a table. It was the original structure, the reason the vault existed, the oldest thing in it. It looked like stone, it was stone, and it was also in a way that Kael could feel rather than see something more than stone, the same quality as the corridor, the same listening quality but concentrated, focused, awake in a sense that was distinct from the vault's general wakefulness. Seren stood before it, Marit was to the side recording. Kael stood at the chamber's entrance, which felt like the right place, not because he was excluded, but because proximity had an order here and that order mattered. Do you want me to explain what's happening? Seren asked. She addressed this to him specifically. If you want to explain it. I want you to understand it, she said. It's not a simple transfer, it's not like reading a document. The vault contains something that needs to be understood in order to be received, and understanding it changes the person who understands it. That's by design. The First Order didn't want this knowledge loose. They wanted it held by people who could be changed by it, because the kind of person who is changed by it is the kind of person who will handle it correctly. Changed how? Marit asked from her corner, not anxiously, with the precision of someone who wants the terminology accurate. Changed in the sense of having a responsibility they didn't have before, Seren said. The knowledge creates an obligation not to do anything specific, to make a judgment each time the knowledge could be applied about whether it should be. She looked at Kael. That's why the conclave can't have it, not because they're evil, because they're institutional. Institutions can't bear the obligation, it can only be carried by individuals. Kael was quiet for a moment, and when an individual who carries it dies, he asked. It goes dormant, she said, back into the world in a diminished form, waiting for the next person who can hold it. A slight pause. I've been carrying it since my teacher died 9 years ago. She was old, she chose me, I didn't choose it. But you kept it. I kept it, she said simply. She turned back to the formation of stone. She placed both hands on it this time, and the quality of the chamber changed, not dramatically, not with light or sound in any theatrical sense, but in the way that the quality of a room changes when a conversation shifts from preliminary to essential. Something settled, something that had been in a state of readiness moved into a state of action. Marrett was recording. Kael stood at the entrance to the chamber and felt the vault around him in a way he had never quite felt it before, not just listening now, but engaged, present, doing whatever it had been designed to do across a span of time that made his 4 centuries look recent. He could not see what Seren was receiving, he could not hear it. What he could perceive was her, the way she stood, the way her breathing changed slightly and then steadied, the way the quality of stillness around her shifted from a person standing still to something more like a landscape, something that simply was. He watched this with the same quiet attention he brought to things worth watching, and he did not look away, and he thought about what she had said, that the knowledge creates an obligation, and he thought about the vault and his 4 centuries in it, and what it meant that he had been chosen, and whether he was ready for the thing that was coming next. She stood at the formation for close to an hour. Marrett worked steadily in her corner. Kael did not move from the entrance. The chamber was entirely quiet in a way that felt positive rather than empty, full rather than absent. When Seren stepped back, her expression was the same as when she'd entered and also completely different. The face was the same. Everything behind it had rearranged slightly, the way a room looks different after the light changes, even though nothing in it has been moved. She looked at Kael for a moment without speaking, then she said, "Your turns." He walked into the chamber, he stood before the formation. Up close, it looked exactly as it had from a distance, old stone, the oldest stone in this place, and it also looked from this proximity like something that had been expecting him specifically, which was a thought he held without judgment, neither rejecting it as sentiment nor accepting it uncritically, simply letting it be there as what it was. He placed his hands on the stone. What happened next was something he was never able to adequately describe to anyone who asked later, which was partly because the content of it was difficult to put into language and partly because the experience of it was not at its core about content. It was about recognition. He had the sense, sustained and specific and impossible to dismiss as imagination, of understanding something that he had been circling for a very long time without knowing that he was circling it. A shape becoming visible, a pattern completing itself, not revelation in the grand sense, no light, no voice, no sense of the divine or the cosmic, but the much quieter and in some ways more permanent experience of something clicking into clarity after a long period of being almost clear. The obligation that Seren had described was real. He felt it establish itself not as a burden but as a weight, the good kind of weight that tells you you're holding something worth holding. He stood with it for a while and let it settle into him the way the vault's air had settled into his lungs every time he had walked down here for 4 centuries. When he stepped back, Marrett was watching him. Her expression was the same arithmetic expression, but it had something in it he hadn't seen before. "Well," she said. "I understand," he said. She nodded. "Good, then we can begin the actual work." The actual work was not quick, and it was not simple, and none of them had expected it to be. It stretched across the following weeks and into the following months, Marrett staying in the fortress as a guest, an actual guest in rooms above ground, with windows that showed the mountains and a study that Kael gave up for her use without any indication that this was a significant concession. and the three of them meeting regularly to work through the implications of what had been received and what to do with it. The conclave came as they had known the conclave would come. Not in force, they were not foolish, but in the form of an emissary, a careful and politically skilled woman who arrived at the gate with the correct diplomatic protocols and a brief that Kael could read between the lines of with very little effort. They knew Marit was here. They suspected, without yet being certain, what had happened in the vault. They wanted to open a negotiation. Kael met the emissary in his upper hall and they had a long conversation that was formally pleasant and substantively extremely direct. He told the emissary several things, all true, with the calm specificity of someone who knows exactly where they stand. He told her that what the vault had contained was no longer in the vault in its previous form, which was accurate. He told her that the knowledge was now held by individuals who had the obligation, by the nature of the thing itself, to make their own judgments about its application. He told her that the conclave's interest was understood and would be given appropriate consideration. And he told her, with the politeness of someone who has perfect manners and zero intention of yielding, that the conclave would not be receiving what it had sent her to retrieve, because what it had sent her to retrieve was not a thing that could be transferred in the way they were imagining. As the emissary left, Kael did not expect this to be the end of it, and it was not. But the ground had been established, and the ground mattered, and the three of them continued their work. 3 months after the unlocking, the vault was opened again. A fourth person this time, a young man that Marit had brought, a student of hers who had shown, over years of careful observation, the specific quality that the knowledge required. Not brilliance exactly, not virtue exactly. Something more like a capacity for genuine responsibility, the ability to carry an obligation without it crushing you or inflating you. Marit had explained the candidate with the thoroughness of someone who had been thinking about succession for a long time and had strong opinions about how it should work. Kael had asked to meet the young man first, which Marit had expected. The meeting had taken place over a meal, a long one, during which Kael had asked questions that seemed tangential and were not, and listened with the attention he brought to things he was taking seriously, and at the end of which he had told Marit he agreed. The young man went into the vault with Seren. Kael and Marit waited in the corridor in the blue flame light and did not talk very much. They had been in each other's company enough by now that silence between them was comfortable, the silence of people who have worked alongside each other long enough to have established a common understanding. "Is this how it continues?" Kael asked after a while. "For now," Marit said, "the obligation transmits, the carriers make judgments. The knowledge doesn't accumulate power, it accumulates responsibility. That's the design." "And the conclave?" "We'll keep trying," she said without drama. "They'll find ways to argue they have a legitimate interest, and sometimes they'll have a point, and we'll need to think carefully about those cases. That's the work." She glanced at him. "It's not a triumph. It's an ongoing problem with a better structure than it had before." "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for a triumph." "No," she said. "I've noticed." He looked at the vault entrance, the old stone, the blue flame light, the corridor that had been here before his fortress and would likely be here after it. "What I'm looking for," he said, "is for this to be handled correctly, for the right people to carry it and the wrong people not to have it, and for the judgment to stay honest." He paused. "That's probably too simple a formulation." "It's the right formulation," Marit said. "The complex version is just this formulation with more detail." He was quiet for a while. "Do you think the First Order knew?" he asked. "When they built this, do you think they knew it would still be here doing this after this long?" Marit considered the question with her arithmetic expression. "I think they hoped," she said. "I think they built it as if it would last, which is different from knowing. It's a more honest relationship with the future, building for it without claiming to predict it." Kael thought about that. He thought about himself 400 years ago, finding this vault in the rock of the Ashspine Mountains and deciding, for reasons he had not been able to fully articulate at the time and could now articulate somewhat better, to build his home above it rather than anywhere else. He thought about patience as a form of faith, not faith in anything specific, not the religious kind, but the faith implied by the act of caring for something without knowing what it is. The faith of leaving the table set. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Seren and the young man came back into the corridor, and the quality of them had changed in the way that Kael had now seen twice, and that he did not think would ever stop being something worth watching. The young man had the look of someone who has just been given a responsibility they did not expect to receive and who understands already that it will change how they see everything. Seren was watching him the way you watch someone you've just trusted with something important, attentive and steady, and ready to help if it goes wrong. She looked at Kael. "He's good," she said. "Yes," said Kael, "I thought he would be." Later, much later, when the young man had gone south with Marit and the immediate work of this phase was done and the fortress had settled back into its ordinary life, which was a different ordinary than before, Kael went down to the vault alone. He walked the corridor at his usual pace in the usual light and stepped into the inner chamber and stood before the formation of stone that had been at the center of this place before there was a place around it. He did not touch it. He had received what it had to give him, had felt the obligation settle in and become part of him the way certain things become part of you, not dissolving into you, but remaining distinct and real and present, something you carry rather than something you become. He stood there and he thought about Seren, who had returned above ground to a life that now had different dimensions than it had before, who was no longer simply a hidden person, but a person who had delivered something and received something and come out the other side of both. She was still in the fortress. She had not left, and he had not asked her to, and neither of them had made any explicit statement about what that meant, which was a silence he found himself comfortable with in the way that you find yourself comfortable with a silence that is not empty. She had rooms in the western wing now, proper rooms with windows, and she read, and she walked in the upper courtyard, and she came to find him sometimes when he was in his study, and they talked for hours about things that were and were not related to the vault. He thought about what she had said in their first real conversation about the Order's protection and the life it had required. Not the best option, she had said, the best available option. He thought about what the difference was and what it meant to be past the place where the best available was the best you could hope for. He thought this was possibly one of the things that the vault's obligation produced, not just responsibility for the knowledge, but a different relationship with possibility. The sense that things could be arranged better, not perfectly, but better, and that better was worth working for without requiring perfection as justification. He put his hand on the vault wall, not the formation, just the wall, the old stone, the listening stone. He felt it in the way he had always felt it, the quality of presence and attention, the sense of something vast and patient that had been doing its work across a span of time that made his own history feel recent. Good, he said, to the vault, to the stone, to the presence that had been waiting and was, he supposed, still waiting, not for the same thing now, but for the next thing, the ongoing thing, the continuation of whatever project this place had been built to be part of. He said it quietly, just the one word. He meant it as what it was, a simple acknowledgement between one patient thing and another that something had gone right. The vault said nothing. The vault did not need to. He turned and walked back down the corridor, the blue flame light steady around him, and climbed the stairs back into the world above, where his court was waiting and the morning was already well underway. and where, in the western wing, the most valuable prisoner he had ever kept was no longer a prisoner at all, and knew it.